Hello, thanks for joining. Let's get comfy and maybe grab your favorite John Stamos body pillow and assume the big spoon position. How about we put a little burning fireplace in that bottom right corner for some ambient noise? Fireplace, please. Guys, the fireplace, there it is, splendid. Hard to find good help these days. Wait, that is much too large. Smaller, please, and in the corner. Good. Now, how about some embers? Embers, please. Very good. Looks like we are all set for this monumental journey. But first, if you would not mind liking and subscribing, it helps us out more than you know. And drop a comment on what country you reside in. We are always curious in where our viewers are from. Now let's begin. You've just opened your eyes in the year 1325. Good news, you're not dead. Bad news, neither are the fleas. Your bed is basically a decomposing haystack, swarming with bugs and stuffed with straw that smells like barnyard funk. Because, well, it used to be part of a barn floor. Forget memory foam or pillows. You're swaddled in a crusty wool blanket that hasn't seen soap since last winter and now weighs more than a sheep. The distant clang of the church bell jolts you fully awake. Think of it as the medieval snooze button, except it's screaming at you, not gently nudging. Your house? A one-room wooden shack with no windows and a lovely open layout, if you like sharing your space with goats, chickens, and a few too many family members. The air is thick with a scent cocktail of stale ale, sweat, livestock, and something you'd rather not identify. Scented candles? Not invented, and even if they were, they'd just melt into the dirt floor. You stretch, immediately regret it. The cold air hits your joints like a hammer. You're 22 years old, which puts you at about middle-aged in this era. Your back crackles, your knees grind like a bag of gravel. Welcome to the age of early arthritis. Now comes the daring part. Stepping out of bed. The floor is either soggy from last night's rain, thanks leaky thatched roof, or crusted with who knows what from the neighbour's rogue chicken. Either way, your bare feet are now one with the microbial world. And privacy? Ha! Everyone's waking up with you, your parents, siblings, and that cousin who just never left. No bedroom, no curtains, no alone time. Everything's communal, including the lice. Congratulations, it's morning in medieval Europe. You've emerged from your itchy, straw-stuffed cocoon. Great job. Now, nature is calling, and not with a polite whisper, but with a medieval yell. Ready to miss your modern bathroom yet? There's no toilet, no seat, no toilet paper, not even a sad little plunger in the corner. Back then, relieving yourself was less of a private ritual and more of a public obstacle course. For peasants, the bathroom is a glorified bucket out back, which is probably overflowing because Uncle Wulfric had a bad turnip situation last night. The stench? Let's call it biblical. You do your business, hold your breath, and then, toss it into the street, right into the street. That's how it was done. You're supposed to yell something like garde lo, meaning look out below. But most people don't yell or look out. Streets are flowing with sewage, animal droppings, and fluids you don't want to analyze. If you're lucky enough to live in a town with public latrines, congrats. You now get to sit elbow to elbow with strangers in a dark wooden box with no airflow and even less dignity. Try to make small talk without inhaling too deeply. Toilet paper? That's a fantasy. Most folks wiped with whatever nature provided, straw, moss, a spare rag, or if you're lucky, a threadbare scrap of wool. Some skipped wiping altogether, which may explain why nobody's into handshakes yet. And if you live in a castle, surely it's more civilized. Not really. Castles came equipped with garderobes, just a hole in the wall that dropped waste straight into the moat. Elegant until an enemy decides to sneak in through the waste chute. Yep, that happened. So whether you're a humble farmer or a wealthy lord, going to the bathroom was a public, messy, and deeply humiliating ordeal. Slippery paths meant faceplants into literal human leftovers weren't rare. And you still haven't brushed your teeth. That horror show's coming up next. Congrats! You've survived medieval bathroom time. Let's reward you with breakfast. Except, breakfast isn't going to reward you back. In fact, it might insult you. There are no scrambled eggs, no pancakes, not even a sad slice of toast. Breakfast in the 1300s is a tragic little bowl of pottage, a chunky greyish stew made from yesterday's leftovers, reheated with whatever root vegetables you managed to dig up. Think oatmeal with an identity crisis. It's been simmering for days, maybe weeks. Each new meal just gets dumped in on top of the old, like culinary archaeology. Bonus points if there's a stale hunk of bread to gnaw on. But don't get too excited. That bread is rock hard, made from coarse grains, sometimes bulked up with ground bark or sawdust. You don't slice this thing, you survive it. As for drinks, you're not sipping OJ or lattes, nope, you're drinking beer. At 6 a.m. Why? Because the water could kill you, literally. Rivers and wells are crawling with bacteria, parasites, and the occasional floating goat. The ale is weak and warm, but it's boiled, so at least it's safer. Even the kids drink it. No one's thrilled, but it's better than cholera. Forget meat or cheese. Those are for feast days or if your local lord is feeling oddly generous. Most peasants only see meat a few times a year, and usually not the good parts. Fruit? Maybe, if it's in season. Spices? Absolutely not. A pinch of pepper costs more than your monthly income, so you sit by the fire, if you're lucky, sipping weak beer, chewing bread that could break teeth, and trying not to gag on your beige stew. Fueled by disappointment, it's time to get dressed. Spoiler alert. Your closet isn't bursting with options. You own one outfit, one. It's a shapeless tunic made of scratchy wool or stiff linen. It smells like everything you've done for the past 6 months because, you guessed it, it's never been washed. Underwear, optional. Laundry, a full-scale operation involving river water, wood fires, and a full day off, which you don't have. Soap is expensive. So you wear your outfit into the ground and hope it disintegrates before you do. Shoes? Only if you're lucky. And even then, they're thin leather with zero support. Most folks go barefoot, through mud, manure, and whatever sharp thing the earth decides to throw at you. As for hygiene, let's not even pretend. You are a walking ecosystem. Lice, fleas, and bedbugs are part of the family now. Everyone itches, scratches, and moves on. No one bats an eye. You may be crawling with parasites, but hey, at least you're not alone. Next up, oral hygiene, or lack thereof. Let's flash that morning smile, except you don't. Because in medieval times, smiling could be downright terrifying, not emotionally, dentally. There's no toothbrush, no toothpaste, no floss. Not even a vague concept of mouthwash. Oral hygiene isn't neglected, it simply doesn't exist. If you're lucky, someone might chew on a stick or rinse with a splash of vinegar, but mostly your teeth are fending for themselves. By your mid-20s, your smile likely resembles a haunted house. Cavities? Common. Swollen gums? A given. And those aren't coffee stains on your teeth, that's decay. Rot is practically a lifestyle. Rich folks might have sugar imported at ridiculous cost, but all it does is rot their teeth faster. Peasants have it slower, chewing gritty bread and fermenting their mouths with whatever questionable food they can find. Got a toothache? Welcome to the background soundtrack of your life. It throbs like a heartbeat made of knives. Options: you pray, you drink, you pull the tooth out yourself. Yes, seriously. Or you visit the barber, who also pulls teeth. With what? A rusty hook, an iron clamp, no anesthesia. If it gets infected, congratulations. You now have a life-threatening condition. That aching molar might kill you. A bad tooth in the 1300s is basically a death sentence dressed in gum pain. And kissing? Let's just say it wasn't for the faint of heart. Now that your mouth feels like a battlefield, it's time to earn your keep. Except there's no salary, no benefits, and certainly no casual Fridays. You're a peasant. And in medieval Europe, that means your job is survival, on someone else's land under someone else's rules. Your office is a field, your commute, stepping outside. You rise with the sun and don't stop until it disappears behind the trees. Your tools are primitive, a wooden hoe, a rusted sickle, and whatever strength your aching limbs still have. 6 days a week from dawn to dusk you plough, sow, weed, and haul water. Sundays are supposed to be for rest, but let's be honest. If there's a storm coming or the harvest is late, you're still working. Mental health? Unheard of. You break your back and hope your knees don't give out before the winter does. Women have it worse. Not only are they expected to toil in the fields, but they also raise children, cook, clean, spin wool, tend livestock, and serve as walking insect playgrounds, all while trying to ignore their husband's lice. Kids start young, like age 5, young. No school, no toys, just chores, and maybe a wooden stick they name for fun. Their future? Hopefully not dying of something preventable. If you're not a farmer, you might be a tanner, blacksmith, or cooper. Sounds fancy, but it's all hazardous, smelly, and thankless. The pay? Enough to barely survive. Sick day? No such thing. If you don't work, you don't eat. And there's always someone hungrier, ready to take your place. So you grip that shovel, ignore the blisters, and dig. Because your job isn't a career, it's a countdown. Let's talk about the weather, because it's not just unpleasant. It's an accomplice to your suffering. In winter, your home becomes a glorified freezer. There's no insulation, just planks with gaps wide enough to spot the neighbor's goat through. Windows, if you have any, they're covered with cloth. That hearth? Cozy until the firewood runs out, because wood is scarce, and collecting it can get you fined or executed. You wrap yourself in the same damp wool you've worn all year, crowd around fading embers, and still wake up with frozen toes. Frostbite isn't diagnosed, it's just bad luck. Then comes summer, and your hut turns into a sweatbox. No fans, no deodorant, just layers of sticky, smelly fabric. You can't take them off either. Modesty, sunburn, and swarms of flies say otherwise. Mosquitoes hum in your ears. Flies dive into your pottage. The smell of human funk blends with last week's stew, still bubbling in the corner. And through it all, you still have to work. Heat stroke? That's called a bad turn. You get no relief, just more labor, more sweat, and more medieval misery. Seasons don't bring variety, they bring fresh styles of torment. And through it all, your food is awful, your clothes still itch, and your body still aches. Welcome to weather in the Middle Ages, always the villain, never the break. Feeling thirsty? Need a little refresh? Want to splash your face and feel vaguely alive again? Too bad. In the Middle Ages, water isn't your friend. It's a silent assassin, bubbling with lies, parasites, and regret. That sparkling stream near the village might look pristine, but it's not. Upstream, someone probably dumped their chamber pot, or a dead animal, or both. You're one sip away from the full medieval digestive fireworks show, which is why, hilariously, beer was the breakfast beverage. If you were richer, wine was an option. Because what better way to start your day than buzzed and bloated? And don't get too excited about bathing either. The medieval mindset saw water as suspicious. People thought washing opened your pores, and through those pores diseases snuck in like stealthy little death ninjas. So many folks avoided bathing not out of laziness but out of sheer terror. Public bathhouses existed, sure, but they quickly earned reputations as gossip pits and brothels. Naturally, the church caught wind and began cracking down. Bathhouses were shut, banned, or repurposed for more holy endeavors. So even if you wanted to scrub yourself, good luck finding a tub. and privacy. And if you did, better make it quick. Boiling enough water to fill a tub took hours. The tub itself leaked. And heaven help you if someone else used the water first. Rainwater? Sure, you could collect it in a barrel, but you're also collecting bird poop, bugs, and algae. Tasty. So whether you drank it, bathed in it, or just looked at it funny, water in the Middle Ages was less a resource and more a gamble, a game of intestinal roulette. One wrong gulp and you're clenching your stomach, sweating in your lice-ridden bed, whispering your final regrets to the rat chewing your sleeve. Feeling sick? Naturally. You need a doctor, which means you're about to meet someone who's about as qualified as a modern barista, but with fewer tools and more leeches. Medical knowledge in medieval times wasn't science. It was a bizarre mashup of superstition, ancient Greek philosophy, and whatever the local monk scribbled in the margins of his psalter. The grand theory? Humours. You were made of 4 basic fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Feeling off? Clearly your internal soup is out of balance. Got a fever? Too much blood? The solution? Let's cut you open and let some out. Yep, bloodletting was standard. Blades, leeches, even heated glass cups. Congratulations, your treatment is medieval exsanguination. Feeling blue or anxious? That's probably too much black bile. Cure? A laxative or a prayer or both. Maybe your soul's just being punished for impure thoughts. Or breathing weird. Either way, someone's lighting incense, someone else is sharpening a knife, and the village priest is already whispering your last rites, just in case. Break a bone? Sorry, no morphine. Surgery means getting pinned to a wooden table while someone jabs around with unwashed iron tools. The best case scenario? Passing out. Worst case? Screaming until your vocal cords resign. Germ theory didn't exist yet. Sterilization was what happened when you accidentally sat on a hot coal. Antibiotics? Centuries away? Disinfectant? That's wine, maybe, unless it's needed for drinking. The best chance you had was luck. And if you survived, they didn't thank medicine. They thanked God, or leeches, or both. To sum up, getting medical attention in the Middle Ages was like rolling the dice while already on fire. The doctors meant well, but sometimes the cure hurt more than the plague. And now, after a day full of parasites, hard labor, and near-death treatments, it's time for the one thing that should bring joy. Dinner. Except, spoiler alert, dinner is out to kill you too. Just when you think it can't get worse, it does. The Middle Ages, like a bad house guest, keep finding new ways to overstay their welcome. And now it's time to talk about violence. Not the occasional bar brawl or poetic duel, but systemic, normalized, and often very public acts of brutality that shaped every layer of life. Let's be clear, the Middle Ages were not peaceful. If anything, they were a slow-motion riot, held together with faith, fear, and that one guy in every village who owned a sword for reasons. The idea of justice was more performance than principle. You didn't get a fair trial, you got a spectacle. Steal a loaf of bread, that could cost you a hand. Gossip too much? Here's a scold's bridle, a metal muzzle strapped to your face with a tongue clamp for good measure. Lie under oath? Enjoy having your tongue pierced or removed. Accused of something serious like heresy, blasphemy, or witchcraft? Now you're in the VIP lane to public torture. Medieval justice had a flair for drama. Trials weren't about evidence, they were about endurance. One method, trial by ordeal, involved dunking you in a river. Sink? You're innocent and dead. Float? You're guilty, obviously. Another option, shove your hand into boiling water to grab a stone. If it heals clean in 3 days, you're innocent. If it festers, well, enjoy your branding. And punishment wasn't behind closed doors. Executions were public events. People brought snacks. Families gathered to watch hangings, beheadings, or the occasional burning. Kids would climb trees for a better view. It was the Netflix of the day, only with more screaming. Domestic violence? Legal and often encouraged. Husbands could discipline their wives and children. Strangers could beat each other in the streets over spilled beer or a bad glance. Bloodshed wasn't a breakdown of order, it was part of it. And if you were unlucky enough to live near a border or a particularly cranky lord, warfare was a seasonal hobby. Castles got sacked, villages got razed, armies showed up to recruit or loot, or both. And war, by the way, wasn't neat rows of soldiers and glorious trumpet blasts. It was mud, panic, screaming, and whoever survived the longest. If you were drafted, congratulations. You'd get a wooden spear, some vague directions, and a firm goodbye. Armor? Only if you were rich. Training? Don't trip. Your life expectancy on the battlefield was somewhere between ouch and oops. Peasant uprisings weren't uncommon either. Push people too hard, steal too much grain, and even the kindest village could snap. But rebellions rarely ended well. The army would sweep in, stomp the revolt, and make brutal examples of everyone involved. Heads on spikes weren't just decoration, they were warnings. All this created a society where fear was currency. Fear of the Lord, fear of the church, fear of disease, demons, strangers, and winter. But most of all, fear of being next. And through this blood-soaked backdrop, people still had to live, work, fall in love, raise children, tell stories. You didn't stop because someone got burned at the stake last week. You just talked about it while milking a goat. Even nobles weren't exempt. Sure, they had more food, better clothing, and walls around their homes, but they also had targets on their backs. Power struggles were constant. Cousins murdered cousins. Assassination by poison was so popular, it could have been a competitive sport. Paranoia wasn't a personality trait, it was survival. And the knights we think of today, the shining armor, gallant posture, rescuing maidens, most were more interested in land, loot, and stabbing. They weren't polite heroes, they were glorified warlords with better branding. Honor existed, but it was flexible. Duels happened over anything from insults to inheritance disputes. Winning meant you were right. Losing meant you didn't matter anymore. The court systems where they existed were chaotic. Nobles could buy verdicts, clergy could claim sanctuary. Peasants, they hoped for a merciful priest or a sleepy bailiff. Justice was more a coin flip than a principle, and into this violent, unpredictable mess came diseases. Again, the plague didn't just roll through once and leave. It lingered, came in waves. Just as villages were rebuilding, another outbreak would hit. The mortality rate was brutal. Towns vanished overnight. The trauma hung in the air, unspoken but ever-present. People turned to superstition. They wore amulets, burned incense, flogged themselves in public to appease divine wrath. Others blamed witches, Jews, foreigners, anyone who could be targeted. Pogroms, burnings, mass expulsions followed. Fear turned into fury, and fury turned into genocide. So what did all this violence do to a person, to a society? Now that we've trudged through the filth, fear, famine, and flame, it's worth asking, how did people keep going? How did anyone in the Middle Ages find the will to push forward when each sunrise brought another dose of suffering? The answer? They held on to whatever scraps of joy, routine, and meaning they could. Because even when the world is awful, humans have an annoying habit of adapting. Let's start with daily life. Yes, it was hard, but it wasn't non-stop misery. Most people weren't walking around moaning in despair all day. They had tasks, responsibilities, chores. Those things didn't leave time for existential dread. When you're hauling water or baking dark rye bread with a side of charcoal, you don't have space to wonder about the futility of it all. Routines were everything. Sunrise meant work, midday meant prayer, evening meant stories by the fire if there was one, or collapsing into your straw pile. Life ran like a script etched into bone, unchanging, repetitive, but oddly comforting in its predictability. There was rhythm, even if the melody was harsh. And in between the disease and dismemberment, people actually had fun, that's right. Medieval people laughed a lot. They had jokes, slapstick humor, songs about farting, and puppet shows where demons were the punchlines. They danced during festivals, drank heavily during weddings, and roasted each other with insults sharper than their kitchen knives. They played games, yes, games, dice, wrestling, early forms of soccer, and even mock battles where nobody died, usually. Festivals were the medieval version of "we need this." There were saint days, harvest feasts, and even bizarre local celebrations like Feast of the Ass or Goat-Tossing Tuesday, don't ask. They were loud, chaotic, and joyous. For a moment, the mud and misery took a backseat to maypoles, music, and mediocre mead. Even romance found a way. Courtship might have started as a business deal, but love still showed up. People wrote poems, carved initials into tree bark, and sneaked kisses behind barns. Secret lovers met under moonlight, and marriages, though often arranged, sometimes turned into partnerships. People fell in love despite everything, or maybe because of it. And then there were the stories. Oh, the stories. Oral tradition was how wisdom survived when books were rare and literacy rarer. Around every hearth and crossroads tales were told. Legends of brave knights, clever peasants, angry saints, and wicked wolves. Morals were optional, entertainment was mandatory. There were tales of ghosts that haunted moors, devils that lived under bridges, and magical relics buried in the forest. Every village had its own folklore, often built from fear but told with flair. It wasn't just escapism, it was culture, memory, and resistance wrapped in words. Art existed too, crude, colourful, full of meaning. Wall carvings, embroidered tapestries, marginalia in manuscripts where monks doodled rabbits fighting snails. The medieval mind might have been weighed down by theology, but imagination was alive and well. Even in church, where the tone was usually fire and brimstone, music softened the edges. Gregorian chants, hymns, and psalms filled cathedrals with beauty. The acoustics turned even simple melodies into emotional floods. For peasants who had little else, it was magic. Children were everywhere. Childhood wasn't cherished the way it is today, but kids still played. They made dolls from rags, swords from sticks, and games from imagination. They raced, tumbled, got into trouble. They were loud, chaotic, and hopeful, the living proof that life stubbornly marches forward. And hope, fragile and flickering, was always present. Not grand, cinematic hope. Tiny moments, a mother's lullaby, a friend sharing the last crust of bread, a healer whispering reassurance as she rubbed herbs into a fevered brow. These were the stitches that held people together. So yes, the Middle Ages were brutal. But they weren't just brutal, they were human, full of contradictions. Pain and play, despair and defiance, disease and dancing. It was an age where survival was rebellion, and every small joy was a triumph. And maybe that's the real legacy of the medieval world. Not the castles or crusades, but the resilience, the ability to live anyway, to laugh when things were worst, to sing while digging graves, to fall in love with someone whose teeth you've actually seen. The people of the Middle Ages weren't just victims of history, they were participants, fighters, creators, survivors. They didn't just endure the darkness, they lit candles in it. We've covered everything from lice and latrines to laughter and legends. But what about progress? Was the medieval world truly stagnant? Or were there signs of something stirring beneath the dirt and ash? Because as much as the Middle Ages get painted as backwards and brutish, they were also a breeding ground for change. A slow, painful, stubborn kind of progress. But progress nonetheless. Let's start with towns. In the early part of the era, life was overwhelmingly rural. Most people lived scattered across farmland, barely travelling more than 10 miles in their lifetime. But as time rolled on, towns began to swell. Trade routes formed, markets popped up. Local lords realized they could make more money taxing commerce than they could by squeezing peasants. So towns were encouraged, walls were built, charters were granted, and suddenly a new kind of life emerged, urban life, crowded and chaotic, but alive. In towns, things moved, ideas, goods, gossip. You could be a shoemaker, a scribe, a merchant. You didn't have to be stuck in the dirt, tugging a plough until your spine gave out. For some, towns offered a ladder, still rickety but climbable. Guilds formed, apprenticeships offered training, crafts became respected trades, and with trade came connection, silk from China, spices from India, mathematics from the Arab world. Medical texts preserved and expanded by Islamic scholars made their way into Europe. The world, once so closed off, began to crack open. Slowly, unevenly. But open it did. Education started to matter more, at least in some circles. Monasteries had always preserved knowledge, but by the high Middle Ages, cathedral schools began growing into something larger. Universities. The first ones in Bologna, Oxford and Paris were awkward things, run by monks and fueled by parchment and debate. But they were revolutionary. Knowledge wasn't just being hoarded, it was being shared. The rediscovery of ancient texts from Greece and Rome, filtered through Arabic translations, sparked new thinking. Logic, philosophy, natural science. People started asking questions again, dangerous, thrilling questions. Not everyone liked that. The church certainly had opinions, but the seed was planted, and it would grow. Architecture also flourished. Romanesque gave way to Gothic. Massive stone cathedrals soared skyward, not just as places of worship, but as feats of engineering. They were built over decades, sometimes centuries, employing thousands. For many, working on a cathedral was the only job they'd ever know, but they took pride in it. Their chisel marks still echo in those stones today. Even art shifted. Religious paintings remained dominant, but storytelling through imagery evolved. Illuminated manuscripts became more detailed. Stained glass turned sunlight into scripture. Marginal drawings poked fun at authority with subversive wit. The seeds of Renaissance creativity were already being scattered. Women, though largely excluded from formal power, carved out spaces too. Some became mystics, healers, abbesses. Hildegard of Bingen wrote music, science, and theology. Christine de Pizan penned feminist philosophy before the word existed. These weren't exceptions, they were the edge of a coming wave. Technology advanced as well. Water wheels, windmills, the heavy plough. These innovations made agriculture more productive. The mechanical clock began to appear in towns, slicing the day into hours and minutes. Time, once fluid and dictated by bells or sun, became something measurable, something valuable. And then, near the tail end of the era, came the game changer, the printing press. Gutenberg's invention in the mid-15th century cracked the world open. Books, once rare and hand-copied by monks, could be produced by the hundreds. Information, stories, arguments, replicable, portable, unstoppable. Was this a full-blown enlightenment? Not yet, but it was coming. The medieval period wasn't a dead zone. It was a forge, crude, noisy, dangerous, but it shaped what came next. So the next time someone calls something medieval as an insult, remember this. Yes, it was muddy and harsh and violent, but it was also a crucible of transformation. And in the shadow of plague, poverty, and persecution, people built things, cathedrals, cities, philosophies, dreams that still stand today. That's the twist ending of the Middle Ages. Not just that people survived, but that they built the world we now live in. Despite all its hardships, the Middle Ages never existed in a vacuum. What happened across its centuries rippled outward, reshaping everything that followed. To truly understand what came after Renaissance, Reformation, the modern world, you have to look at what the Middle Ages set in motion. Let's start with belief. Religion was everywhere, yes, but it wasn't monolithic. The centuries saw countless schisms, heresies, debates, and reforms. Movements like the Cathars and the Waldensians questioned the Church's power. Some called for purity, others for poverty, and all of them were met with fire, sometimes literally. Yet every challenge left a mark. Seeds of dissent would one day bloom into full-blown revolutions. And as literacy crept outward, scripture left the cathedral. People began to wonder, what did the Bible actually say? Was the Church's interpretation the only way? These weren't just academic questions, they were sparks. Combine those sparks with a printing press, and suddenly you've got Martin Luther hammering 95 theses to a door in Wittenberg less than a century later. The medieval world laid the gunpowder, the Reformation was the match, political power was shifting too. The feudal model, lords over vassals, peasants at the bottom, had cracks. Kings wanted more authority, nobles wanted more autonomy, the Church wanted everything. Tensions flared, wars were fought not just with swords but with ledgers, marriages and forged documents. Over time, stronger, centralized governments emerged. England, France, Spain, each began to consolidate power. Borders that once meant little solidified. Royal courts replaced feudal councils. Law became something written, debated, recorded, primitive, yes, but also foundational. Then came the rise of cities, not just places to live, but engines of change. As cities grew, so did merchant classes. Wealth wasn't tied to land alone anymore. A new force began to rise, the bourgeoisie. Shopkeepers, bankers, traders, people with money, ambition, and increasing influence. Nobility still held the titles, but these upstarts were rewriting the rules. Commerce drove exploration. As medieval trade networks stretched across Europe, curiosity about the rest of the world grew. Maps became more accurate. Ships became more daring. And although it wouldn't be until the age of exploration that the globe truly opened, the first cracks happened in medieval ports and markets. Sailors whispered about lands beyond the horizon. Some went looking. Science, still tangled in dogma, was stirring. Thinkers like Roger Bacon questioned everything, from optics to alchemy. The natural world, once seen solely through a theological lens, began to be studied on its own terms. Slowly, carefully, but persistently. The idea that knowledge could come from observation, that was revolutionary. Medicine, too, edged forward. Sure, most of it was still humours and herbs, but hospitals began to resemble actual institutions. Medical texts travelled from the Islamic world into Europe. Dissection, once taboo, started again. Not often, not publicly, but enough to matter. Art didn't just evolve, it fractured. Late Gothic gave way to early Renaissance. Paintings grew more lifelike. Perspectives deepened. Artists explored humanity, not just divinity. Suddenly the Virgin Mary had emotions, saints had muscles, and peasants appeared not as props, but as subjects. That shift. It began in the final chapters of the medieval world. Even literature transformed, from anonymous religious texts to named authors writing in local languages, Chaucer's English, Dante's Italian. These weren't just literary milestones, they were cultural lightning rods. People could now hear stories in their own voice. That's power. And underneath it all, a great unspoken shift, the birth of the individual. In a world once defined entirely by roles and rank, a whisper began, what if I matter? What if I think for myself? What if my voice, my work, my belief, my doubt counts? It wasn't the Renaissance yet, but it was the scaffolding, and the people building it, covered in dirt, wrapped in wool, staring down mortality with grim humour and stubborn hope. So no, the Middle Ages weren't just a dark tunnel, they were the forge where modernity was hammered into shape. Bent, burned, sharpened. And what came out on the other side didn't erase the medieval world. It completed it. Now, with all the grime and struggle behind us, we step into the final chapter of this journey, not to leave the Middle Ages, but to fully understand what they left us. Because while we've talked about hardship, humour, invention, and evolution, the truth is, the medieval world never really ended, it just transformed. Let's begin with legacy. Walk into nearly any European city, and you're walking through the bones of the medieval world. Cathedrals that took centuries to complete still dominate skylines. Narrow, winding alleys in city centres follow routes first laid by merchants and masons centuries ago. Street names, town walls, even local laws still echo with medieval origins. Language bears its fingerprints too. Words we speak every day, lord, servant, village, guild, are medieval leftovers. The very idea of surnames came from this era. Occupations, Smith, Baker, places, Hill, Wood, or parentage, Johnson, Richardson. We still carry their labels, even in law and government medieval roots show. Parliaments began as feudal councils. Common law, still practiced in many countries, was hammered out in drafty stone halls by candlelight. Concepts like habeas corpus, trial by jury, even taxation, developed and argued long before the Enlightenment gave them polish. The university system, too, traces back to the medieval thirst for knowledge. Professors still wear robes that were once streetwear for 13th century scholars. Degrees, lectures, dormitories, all borrowed from dusty monastic routines. And beyond structure, there's spirit, that fierce, stumbling curiosity, that mix of reverence and rebellion. The medieval mind wrestled with faith and doubt, order and chaos, survival and wonder. We still do, you can see it in literature. Modern fantasy owes its life to medieval myth. From Tolkien's elves and dragons to Dungeons and Dragons rulebooks, it's a remix of knightly romances, Norse sagas and church sermons about damnation. Even superheroes borrow from medieval templates, cloaked figures on quests, burdened by destiny. And you can feel it in how we view time. The idea of progress, of climbing out of darkness into light, was shaped by how Renaissance thinkers framed the medieval period. They called it the Dark Ages to make their own age shine brighter. But that framing stuck. Even today, medieval is used as an insult, barbaric, backwards, brutal. But the truth is more complicated. The medieval world was messy, yes, but it was also rich, layered, stubbornly alive. It wasn't just a bridge between the fall of Rome and the rise of the modern age, it was its own civilization, shaped by its own values, fears, and dreams. So where does that leave us? It leaves us looking back with clarity. The next time someone lights a candle in a cathedral, recites a wedding vow, reads a fairy tale, or argues over taxes, they're standing in the long shadow of the Middle Ages, not in darkness, but in connection. The peasants, nobles, scribes, and saints, they didn't vanish. They echo in language, in culture, in architecture, in us, because while history moves forward, it also circles, and the more we understand the world that came before us, the better equipped we are to shape the one ahead. So here's to the Middle Ages. Brutal, brilliant, bizarre, and undeniably human, not a footnote, but a foundation. So here we are, standing at the edge of what was, trying to make sense of everything the medieval world pushed forward and what it left behind. But let's go one step deeper. Let's look at the emotional, cultural, and psychological weight that carried through the centuries. Because the Middle Ages weren't just about institutions and structures, they were about people. And people carried trauma, tradition, and transformation with them. Imagine what it meant to live generation after generation in a world with such a high mortality rate. Every family had stories of loss, children, siblings, spouses gone too soon. And yet life had to continue. That resilience, that quiet endurance, became a cultural backbone. It shaped the tone of religion, the purpose of art, and the value of community. Superstition wasn't just nonsense, it was an attempt to control chaos. When science couldn't explain a bad harvest or a strange illness, folklore stepped in. Charms were sewn into clothes, saints were prayed to with desperate regularity, bells were rung to scatter storms. The world was terrifying, but belief gave it shape. And art, real art, became an act of spiritual and emotional translation. A cathedral wasn't just a monument to God, it was a canvas. Every statue, stained glass panel, and ceiling mural was a teaching tool, a tribute, a message from stone to soul. Even peasant carvings on wooden beams held meaning. They weren't trying to impress the ages, they were leaving marks, traces that said, "We were here." The same goes for music. We tend to imagine monks chanting solemnly, and yes, that happened. But there was folk music too, lively, bawdy, and rich with local flavor. Songs passed down orally, evolving with every performance. They were histories, jokes, warnings, lullabies. They told you who you were, where you came from, and what to fear. Family was the center of life, but family extended beyond blood. It meant community. Survival was a group effort. Neighbors mattered. So did guild members, fellow laborers, and even the parish drunk who might still have your back when the roof needed mending. You didn't exist in isolation. Identity was shared. Hospitality, too, was sacred. Pilgrims traveling through towns were offered food and rest, not because people had extra, but because they knew one day it might be them knocking on a stranger's door. That understanding that today's giver could be tomorrow's beggar shaped everything from charity to justice. And let's talk about fear. Fear wasn't just a passing feeling, it was part of the environment. Fear of disease, invasion, excommunication, damnation. But here's the thing, people found ways to cope. Laughter, prayer, storytelling, song. Not as distractions, but as shields. They weren't pretending things weren't bad. They were daring to live anyway. Even the humor was dark, absurdly so. Medieval jokes often centered on death, decay, and divine irony. It was how people processed the brutality around them. It was catharsis. Sometimes all you could do was laugh at the absurdity of it all. So when we remember the Middle Ages, we have to remember the emotional reality. The hope baked into every loaf of bread. The faith behind every candle lit in a dark chapel. The grit in every parent's voice as they told their child to keep going. The stubborn insistence that life, no matter how painful, was still worth something. And maybe that's the most medieval thing of all. Not the plagues or the punishments or the pitchforks, but the perseverance, the daily, unspectacular, profoundly human decision to keep going. Now that we understand the central role of belief, we must step back from the sacred and walk again among the ordinary. The fabric of the medieval world was not held together by faith alone. Beneath every prayer was a pattern. Behind every ritual stood a rhythm. And in the spaces between myth and morality lived the architecture of daily life, both physical and unseen. A medieval village wasn't just a cluster of huts. It was a breathing, living organism, intimately shaped by the seasons, the harvest, the rhythms of sun and moon. Time moved differently. It wasn't owned by a clock, but by tasks. Dawn meant milking, noon meant breaking bread, dusk meant gathering, cleaning, and preparing for the long dark hours when only fire kept fear at bay. The very layout of a village told a story. At its heart stood the church, often the only stone building, with its modest spire pointing heavenward. Around it, timber-framed houses leaned inward, their rooftops nearly touching like neighbors whispering secrets. Paths weren't planned, they emerged, worn by footfall, animal hooves, and the turning of carts. The blacksmith's forge sent up its smoke like a chimney of industry. The mill turned with the creaking patience of grain becoming bread. The alehouse, rough, rowdy, and essential, buzzed with tales, complaints, and the warmth of cheap drink. Each house was its own world, modest for the poor, one room, a hearth, maybe a loft. For the wealthier, multiple chambers, storage, woven tapestries to keep out the cold, and shutters that clacked in the wind. Families lived tightly packed. Grandparents, children, livestock, even guests, sometimes slept under the same thatched roof, separated only by blankets or wooden partitions. Food dictated much of life. For most, it was simple. Bread, onions, porridge, dried beans, cabbage, and what little meat could be afforded, perhaps salted pork or fish when it could be caught or traded. Herbs grew in small gardens, sage, parsley, thyme, not just for flavor, but to ward off illness. Meals were communal. Hands tore bread from a shared loaf. Bowls passed from person to person. To eat alone was rare and often suspicious. Clothing, too, followed invisible rules. Most people wore wool, heavy, scratchy, dyed with plant-based pigments that faded quickly. Undergarments, if they had any, were linen. Colors and cuts were social markers. Bright hues, fur linings or shoes with long pointed toes announced one's status. Hats mattered. Coifs, hoods, veils, or felt caps helped signal everything from piety to profession. But beyond what was visible stood what we might call the social skeleton, the unspoken rules of hierarchy, obligation, and expectation. Every person, from peasant to king, had a place. These weren't just roles, they were duties. A lord protected, a serf tilled, a craftsman perfected, a woman managed, a child obeyed, and above all, a person served their God and their land. This social order was reinforced by ceremony. There were festivals, of course, moments of release and shared joy. The Feast of Fools, when rules were inverted. May Day, when fertility was celebrated in dances and green boughs. Harvest festivals lit by fire and crowned with cider. But even daily chores became acts of ritual, crossing oneself before starting a task, whispering a prayer before turning the soil, singing songs during laundry or spinning to pass the time and keep rhythm. Craftsmanship was sacred. The weaver, the potter, the carpenter, these weren't merely laborers, they were creators, keepers of techniques handed down across generations. To make something well was to participate in divine order. Every iron horseshoe, every wooden spindle, every hand-carved spoon was an echo of creation. Mistakes weren't just imperfections. They could be dangerous, believed to invite spirits or misfortune. Even silence had its place. In monasteries, it was revered. Among peasants, it filled the pauses in work, where thoughts drifted and hands moved. In the forests, silence was both gift and warning, suggesting watchful animals or something less natural. The absence of sound could carry weight heavier than words. Work was constant. Leisure was rare. But there was time, however brief, for moments of humanity. Courting in the fields, secret songs between lovers, the shared joy of a newborn child, or the communal mourning of a lost one. Joy and grief were communal events. A life born or lost was not a private matter. It belonged to the village. Children grew up fast. By the age of 7, many were helping with real labor. By 12, girls could be married. But childhood still had wonder. Games made from bones or stones, simple songs sung while skipping, riddles passed along in rhymes. If you listened at the edge of a village, you might hear the laughter of children chasing chickens or racing sticks in a stream. Animals were everywhere, chickens in yards, pigs rooting under fences, dogs sleeping near hearths, cats keeping grain stores free of mice. These creatures were part of the family and part of survival. They were also part of folklore. Black dogs could be omens. Cats, especially black ones, were watched with suspicion. Horses were prized and blessed, often believed to understand more than they let on. The forest stood just beyond the edge of most lives, both a provider and a threat. It offered wood, herbs, berries, game. But it also harbored wolves, thieves, and spirits. Many believed the woods could shift, that paths might vanish, and that those who wandered too deep might return, changed. The forest was not just a place, it was a presence. And looming always, sometimes unseen but deeply felt, was the castle or manor. Even if one never stepped inside its stone walls, its existence defined the rhythms of rural life. The castle was authority, protection, punishment, and pageantry. It cast a long shadow, literally and metaphorically. The lord within its walls was both ruler and neighbor. His word could change lives. His absence could unravel order. Yet even lords answered to someone. The king, the crown, the church, all were part of the great ladder of medieval hierarchy. Nobles might be summoned to war or court, or worse, to judgment. Land could be lost, favor could vanish. And so, even at the top, life was never certain. In this web of labor, belief, duty, and survival, there was also invention. The medieval mind was not static. Innovations like the heavy plough, the horse collar, windmills and water wheels transformed how people lived and worked. Literacy slowly spread, markets grew, guilds formed, people began to move to other villages, to towns, to pilgrimage routes. A slow awakening stirred beneath the weight of tradition. But for most, life remained local. Stories stayed rooted in familiar soil. A child might be born, live, love, labor, and die within 10 miles of their birthplace. And yet, even in that small radius, life was full of joy, sorrow, confusion, celebration, and continuity. So before we move toward the broader sweep of history, before we dive into the trauma, transformation, and spiritual weight carried forward, it's important to pause and see how it all functioned, how water was fetched, how candles were made, how teeth were lost, how seasons turned, how people endured. The invisible scaffolding that held up the grand stories of medieval Europe was not written in scrolls or carved in stone. It was lived in muddy boots and splintered wood, in cracked hands and thick wool, in the closeness of family, the clatter of tools, the smell of bread baking over open flames. These were the heartbeat sounds of a civilization not yet industrial, not yet modern, but never primitive. For the medieval world was never just about kings and crusades. It was about moments, repeated, honored, passed down, and lost. Until we try, centuries later, to imagine them again and feel something stir in the quiet spaces they left behind. So now that we've walked through the structure of medieval daily life, from sunrise to supper, from ploughs to prayer, it's time to peek behind the curtain. What happened not in the sermons or the laws, but in the gaps, those gloriously human gaps, where rules bent, tempers flared, and goats mysteriously went missing. Let's begin with one simple truth. The medieval world was messy, not just physically, though yes, it was muddy, smoky, and occasionally pungent, but emotionally, politically, and socially. Villages were not idyllic pockets of harmony. They were pressure cookers where everyone knew everyone, and sometimes wished they didn't. Take, for instance, gossip, the lifeblood of any good medieval hamlet. Before newspapers, before town criers, there was old Magda leaning out her window, loudly pretending not to listen while hearing everything. News travelled by mouth, reshaped in the telling, embroidered by ale, and weaponized by rivalry. Did you hear about Alric's third daughter? No, not that one. The one with the suspicious mole. Ran off with a travelling piper again. Scandal, slander, and spicy speculation were as common as turnips. And those turnips? Sometimes they were stolen. Not by bandits or warlords, but by the neighbour who just couldn't wait until his crop came in. The line between borrowing and theft was flexible. Chickens wandered, cabbages vanished, goats strayed, though somehow always toward the yard of someone with a history of accidental adoption. And disputes weren't handled with calm mediation. Oh no, they were settled with insults, passive aggression, or if things escalated, rock throwing. You haven't seen drama until you've seen two medieval widows arguing over hedge boundaries with nothing but rusty trowels and hurt feelings. Then there were the local courts, which handled crimes ranging from petty theft to more creative infractions like harbouring spirits in one's chimney or ploughing fields with enchanted oxen. Judges weren't always trained in law, but they were very good at looking stern. Sentences could be practical, repay the stolen eggs, or deeply bizarre. Imagine being sentenced to sit in the stocks with a sign reading, "I mistook my neighbour's cow for a demon." Not that supernatural misunderstandings were rare. In the medieval imagination, everything had a spiritual angle. Stub your toe? Probably the fairies. Lose your hat in the wind? Clearly a sign from the saints. Get caught sneaking ale before church? Well, maybe the devil made you do it. Convenient, isn't it? The devil was an excellent scapegoat, blamed for everything from poor harvests to marital disappointment. He was always suspiciously active around bake ovens, ale barrels, and beds that creaked unexpectedly. Speaking of marriage, it was rarely romantic in the way poets might suggest. It was about land, inheritance, livestock, and how many blankets two people could afford to share without throttling each other. Still, affection did exist, often tucked inside jokes about bad cooking or whispered promises behind haystacks. A good husband was one who didn't forget your name in public. A good wife was one who only hit you with the broom when provoked. And then, of course, came in-laws. The true test of character in the medieval world wasn't battle or piety, it was surviving your spouse's family during feast days. You haven't lived until you've seen a 6-hour debate between uncles about whose ox had the straighter horns, or a grandmother bless the meat while loudly suggesting it's overcooked. Feasts themselves were ambitious. They often featured 7 kinds of meat, 3 types of gravy, and 0 knowledge of seasoning. Bread could double as a plate. Ale flowed like a stream. And dancing, a curious combination of hopping, clapping, and trying not to trip over your neighbour's foot, while pretending to enjoy the lute player's 5th repetition of The Cow's Delight. But not everyone feasted, in fact most people scraped by, and hunger was a familiar guest. This is where medieval ingenuity shone. They learned to make everything edible. Stale bread became stew, thickener. Sour milk, cheese, starter. Even eels found their way into pies, and not in the metaphorical sense. Eel pie was real, chewy, and considered a delicacy. It is perhaps the strongest evidence we have that the past was a different country. And yet, amid the lean times, laughter still thrived. Jesters weren't just for courts. Villages had their own fools, sometimes officially, often informally. These were the folks who could mock the local lord without being beheaded, usually, or who performed impromptu songs in exchange for bread crusts and second-hand socks. They were the pressure valve on a society that could, at times, take itself far too seriously. Then there were the guilds, those proud collectives of tradesmen and craftsmen who regulated quality, fixed prices, and occasionally threw rather exclusive sausage-based festivals. Joining a guild was a bit like joining a family, except instead of birthdays, you were celebrated for reaching the appropriate level of barrel-making competence. To become a master took years, plus the successful completion of a project like make a bed that doesn't collapse under 2 chickens and a baker. Apprenticeships could begin as early as 7 years old. Imagine your first job being 12 years of sweeping pig bristles and fetching your master's soup before you were allowed to so much as touch a chisel. And once you did, heaven help you if you messed it up. Some masters were kind, others had the warm, nurturing presence of a wet sandal. Of course, there were rules about everything: who could wear what, sell what, marry whom, or whistle after dark. Some rules made sense, others less so. One town banned dancing on Mondays after a series of suspicious sprained ankles. Another forbade singing about fish near the well, citing moral decline. Enforcement was inconsistent. The town constable might be enthusiastic during daylight hours, but after supper, well, let's just say moral decay had a bedtime. And then came the superstitions. Never leave shoes upside down or you invite death. If your candle flickers 3 times, someone's telling lies. If a bat circles your chimney twice, your mother-in-law is about to visit. These beliefs weren't quaint, they were practical insurance policies in a world with limited explanations and plenty of reasons to be nervous. And let's be honest, in a village where half the buildings leaned suspiciously and the pigs outnumbered the books, you took signs wherever you could get them. Death itself was part of daily life, but not always morose. People prepared for it the way we prepare for dinner guests, begrudgingly, and with an eye toward presentation. A good death meant saying goodbye, setting your affairs in order, and ideally, dying in your own bed, not while falling off a barn roof because you tried to impress a milkmaid. Graves were shallow, prayers were deep, and the community always came to send you off, partly to mourn, partly to check who inherited your goose. And yet, life went on. Babies were born in cold rooms by exhausted women, assisted by midwives who knew more than most doctors. Names were reused from ancestors, saints, or strong-sounding weather events. Stormborn wasn't fantasy, it was Tuesday. Between birth and death came ritual, repetition, and the unofficial games of peasant survival. How long could you keep your boots intact? How many eggs could you hide from the tithe collector? Could you fall asleep faster than the rats? And still there was pride. Pride in surviving winter, pride in a successful harvest, pride in your bread rising properly for once. These were quiet victories, celebrated not with banners but with long sighs and extra spoonfuls of porridge. So while the songs of kings and knights filled the halls of history, it's here, in the crooked alleyways, smoky kitchens, goat-strewn commons and gossip-laced air, that the true medieval story unfolded. It was a world both reverent and ridiculous, sacred and slapstick, built on layers of tradition, superstition, and shared stubbornness. And that perhaps is the most beautiful thing of all. The people of the medieval world weren't so different. They were just trying to stay warm, stay fed, and get through the week without starting a feud over a missing duck. Let the scholars argue over dates and dynasties. Let the monks copy their illuminated scrolls. We'll stay down here, where the stories actually happened. Where the mud was real, the rules were flexible, and nothing, not even a haunted butter churn, could stop the march of life. Now, with all the grime and struggle behind us, we step into the final chapter of this journey, not to leave the Middle Ages, but to fully understand what they left us. Because while we've talked about hardship, humor, invention, and evolution, the truth is, the medieval world never really ended, it just transformed. Let's begin with legacy. Walk into nearly any European city, and you're walking through the bones of the medieval world. Cathedrals that took centuries to complete still dominate skylines. Narrow, winding alleys in city centers follow routes first laid by merchants and masons centuries ago. Street names, town walls, even local laws still echo with medieval origins. Language bears its fingerprints too. Words we speak every day, lord, servant, village, guild, are medieval leftovers. The very idea of surnames came from this era. Occupations, Smith, Baker, places, Hill, Wood, or parentage, Johnson, Richardson. We still carry their labels, even in law and government medieval roots show. Parliaments began as feudal councils. Common law, still practiced in many countries, was hammered out in drafty stone halls by candlelight. Concepts like habeas corpus, trial by jury, even taxation, developed and argued long before the Enlightenment gave them polish. The university system, too, traces back to the medieval thirst for knowledge. Professors still wear robes that were once streetwear for 13th century scholars. Degrees, lectures, dormitories, all borrowed from dusty monastic routines. And beyond structure, there's spirit, that fierce, stumbling curiosity, that mix of reverence and rebellion. The medieval mind wrestled with faith and doubt, order and chaos, survival and wonder. We still do, you can see it in literature. Modern fantasy owes its life to medieval myth. From Tolkien's elves and dragons to Dungeons and Dragons rulebooks, it's a remix of knightly romances, Norse sagas and church sermons about damnation. Even superheroes borrow from medieval templates, cloaked figures on quests, burdened by destiny. And you can feel it in how we view time. The idea of progress, of climbing out of darkness into light, was shaped by how Renaissance thinkers framed the medieval period. They called it the Dark Ages to make their own age shine brighter. But that framing stuck. Even today, medieval is used as an insult, barbaric, backwards, brutal. But the truth is more complicated. The medieval world was messy, yes, but it was also rich, layered, stubbornly alive. It wasn't just a bridge between the fall of Rome and the rise of the modern age, it was its own civilization, shaped by its own values, fears, and dreams. So where does that leave us? It leaves us looking back with clarity. The next time someone lights a candle in a cathedral, recites a wedding vow, reads a fairy tale, or argues over taxes, they're standing in the long shadow of the Middle Ages, not in darkness, but in connection. The peasants, nobles, scribes, and saints, they didn't vanish. They echo in language, in culture, in architecture, in us, because while history moves forward, it also circles, and the more we understand the world that came before us, the better equipped we are to shape the one ahead. So here's to the Middle Ages. Brutal, brilliant, bizarre, and undeniably human, not a footnote, but a foundation. You are still here, my friend? I can't believe it. This didn't help you fall asleep? Well, I will try harder in the next one to achieve that. You deserve a gold star. You are a trooper. Type gold star in the comments below, and we'll know you made it to the end. I'm sure not many did. Good night, my friend, and thanks again for tuning in.